This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. Remember energy independence? I sure do.
And today, America is closer to energy independence than we have been in decades.
We've got to remain energy independent. It gives us much more power and freedom than to be worried about what goes on in the Middle East.
I will set a national goal of North American energy independence by 2020. North American.
That used to be the catchphrase politicians like to use when talking about fracking or other forms of energy extraction. But President Trump, he's more into energy dominance.
My administration will seek not only the American energy independence that we've been looking for so long, but American energy dominance. And we're going to be an exporter.
Energy dominance means more drilling, more fracking, and more oil and gas development on America's public lands. The result of this push is the U.S. is offering millions more acres a year to lease to the oil and gas industry than it was under President Obama. So what has been the impact of all this drilling? We'll find out in a minute. Stay with us.
Okay, say it louder.
Hello.
Okay.
What are we talking about?
We're talking about ASMR.
I thought we were talking about Trump on Earth.
We were, but now we're talking about ASMR.
I think we should go to a break for our sponsor, Trump on Earth.
Okay, Trump on Earth is our sponsor, and yeah.
Should people support it?
Yes, people should support it. You can look in the beginning of this, and it'll tell you where to support.
No, but where should people go to support it? Is it Patreon?
Yes, it is.
Should they go to patreon.org/Trump on Earth?
Yes, they should.
Why? What happens when they support it?
They help Trump on Earth come out with more podcasts. No derp, dude. That's my new favorite saying. Guys, what's this button do?
This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. President Trump's push to have oil and gas drilling on public lands has hit some snags. A federal court halted leasing on 300,000 acres of public land in Wyoming after the court ruled the administration hadn't adequately considered climate change on the decision to lease. And late last week, a federal judge ruled Trump's efforts to lift an Obama-era ban on drilling in the Arctic and North Atlantic oceans was unlawful. But despite all this, companies are still racing to drill on America's public land with the administration's blessing. So what does this look like on the ground? Well, today we're going to talk about how this strategy is affecting one corner of America, southeast New Mexico, home to Carlsbad Caverns, the Chihuahua Desert, and lots of oil and gas, where the agency in charge of regulating oil and gas simply doesn't have the resources to police the industry. Rachel Leven is a reporter for the Center for Public Integrity. In November, she published an article about an explosion in oil and gas drilling on public lands, and she's here to talk about it with me. Welcome, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Before we get into your reporting, you focused on a branch of the Department of Interior called the Bureau of Land Management. Can you explain what that is and what that agency does?
Sure. The Bureau of Land Management manages our public lands, so lands that are owned by the federal government but can be used for purposes from recreation like hunting or camping to other purposes like oil and gas drilling, where some of those revenues would go back to the general public.
And these are more than just, when a lot of people think of public lands, they think of Yosemite National Park or the local state forest. These are not those.
No, the National Park Service manages those national parks, the ones that we think about when we think we're going to take a trip to go to Carlsbad Caverns, for example, or Acadia National Park and go hiking. But these are actually separate lands that are managed for quote unquote multiple use, basically meaning that the federal government is overseeing these lands and making sure that the public is getting as much benefit out of them, whether that's through leasing those lands for development or keeping those lands for protection of species or allowing people to camp there as possible.
So your reporting took you to southeastern New Mexico. Can you explain what brought you out there?
I had been talking to sources with my boss, and we had basically been looking for ways to tell the story of fossil fuel exports and the impact that it was having here in the United States of us sending our own fossil fuels abroad. And someone mentioned offhandedly that in this one portion of New Mexico, which is part of this very hot formation that a lot of oil and gas drilling is occurring in right now, it's called the Permian Basin, that the federal government actually manages a small part of that land and that they are being overrun. And so from there, I started making calls, and it led to the story.
So your sources said that the federally managed lands were being sort of overrun. What did you find when you got out there?
Chaos, lots and lots of chaos. Basically, I met with a bunch of sources from different sectors who had different uses for the land, whether they were hunters or ranchers or former Bureau of Land Management officials. Basically, just had a bunch of people take me around and show me what was going on. And one of the most powerful moments for me was when one of the ranchers that I went out with pointed us to this development on this large swath of land that he also leases for ranching cattle on. And he said, we're supposed to be notified before this kind of development occurs on land that we also lease for a different purpose. And in fact, that never happened to that day when there was all of this development already in front of me. There were tanks, there was a big water pit going in, and he still hadn't been notified. No one had told him that this was occurring. And that really encapsulated to me kind of the chaos of what's going on out there, that there's just so much development and there is a real difficulty in keeping up with even the administrative parts of those tasks of managing it.
So were you able to tease out why it was so hectic and so chaotic out there? What do you think the factors are?
So there's a bunch, one of which is that we are amidst an oil and gas boom that has basically been propelled by opening up these new markets for us to send our oil and gas products. And so since there are new markets, there is more need to get that oil and gas out of the ground. We can open up more supply. Another thing that basically spoke to the chaos of it is there's just the normal bureaucracy that you would think about of a federal government agency. Like, they were having problems with technology. They were trying to use this permitting software and it didn't work. And so things would be missed from the system, and it just made it harder for staff within that office to get their own job done. And beyond that, just the staffing of the agency was skewed. I mean, there were significantly more people out there working on oil and gas operations as opposed to managing any of the other resources in this super diverse desert area. It's called the Chihuahuan Desert. And so those same people who were trying to manage these other resources also had to clear all of the oil and gas permitting activities, although sometimes that went to consultants, but basically people were just overloaded left and right, and it just made it really hard for them to do their jobs.
We also know that this is a time when the Trump administration is sort of pushing this energy dominance theme on all its federal agencies, and they've sent, instructions to field offices to eliminate impediments to leasing. They're rolling back regulations on, for fracking and methane emissions on public lands. Did your reporting show any of that playing a role in this field office in New Mexico that you saw?
Definitely. Early in the Trump administration, President Trump had signed an executive order that basically said, look to the jobs, look to the benefit of the economy when you are looking at federal actions. And that executive order has actually been cited in some of the actions of this field office in how they choose to use that land, whether they are proposing to open up more of it, for example, to oil and gas drilling. They say, well, it's in line with this executive order that there will be X number more jobs. There's also smaller actions that have taken place in the state field office that are harder to attribute to the Trump administration on the whole, but definitely have occurred during the Trump administration that make the process of oil and gas leasing in this area less transparent to the public and offers less opportunities for public comment. If you talk to the oil and gas industry, they'll say, well, there are plenty of opportunities for public comment. This process just takes so long and it's so overbearing. We don't need all of these opportunities. But if you talk to conservationists and ranchers and others, they'll say, these are missed opportunities for us to find out that development could occur in these areas and to make sure that the process is done correctly.
So you reported that essentially this office can't keep up with sort of the demand for regulation. They're not really staffed up enough to regulate. Can you point to any examples of how that plays out?
The head of one of these field offices that manages the small area of land that I was looking at was basically in a meeting with everyone from oil and gas companies to conservationists. It was an off-the-record meeting, and he very bluntly told them that we don't have the money or the staff to enforce all of the rules that are on the books. So basically that means that people could be not metering appropriately on how much oil and gas they're actually taking up out of the ground, which affects how much money they pay the federal government for the use of that land. Or they could be not adequately or quickly enough reclaiming that land so that that land can be used for other purposes after the oil and gas sector is done with its wells at those lands. So there's a variety of ways that it plays out. But basically it ends up impacting people, especially in this area, outside of the oil and gas industry, who feel like they're going to lose their way of life because they have no one who can stand up for them and make sure that things are done in a way that protects their businesses, like ranching or like hunting.
Your reporting also uncovered some revolving door kind of connections at the New Mexico Bureau of Land Management. In particular, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. What can you tell me about those connections?
Sure. I mean, there are definitely examples of BLM officials going to work for the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association after they leave the Bureau of Land Management, and the Interior's Inspector General, its watchdog agency, has raised concerns about some of those individuals. The one that's best known is Steve Hankey, who is helping to lead the local efforts of BLM and then went to work at the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. So there's definitely that kind of direct revolving door connection, but there's also a coziness between industry and the BLM there, partially because the BLM is so under-resourced that they are leaning disproportionately on industry to help them do their jobs. And that takes a lot of different forms, not the least of which is several years ago, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association donated $800,000 to the BLM that translated directly into staffing at this field office. So they basically paid the agency so the agency could hire people who would eventually then be regulating those same oil and gas companies.
So it was like a donation or something?
Yeah, it was a donation. And those kinds of donations have actually occurred at BLM for some time. There's examples of that happening in Oklahoma as well, where these industry groups give the Bureau of Land Management money, and after those agreements are vetted, there are MOUs in place or just agreements put in place about how that money will be spent by the Bureau of Land Management, and often it relates directly back to the industry itself. Sometimes it's just the industry is saying, you're not processing our permits fast enough. Here is money to do that. Speed up your processing. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. But it is the idea that industry is giving money and defining how it's going to be used, and often it relates directly back to them.
Does all this sort of, we'll get back to that backlog in a second, but does all this have a negative impact on the environment there? Land use, reclamation, emissions, things like that, spills?
Speaking from the people who I talked to in my reporting and from what I saw when I was there, I would say the answer is yes. People are just concerned that more land is being used and leased before other land has been reclaimed, meaning that it's been fixed so that it can be used for other purposes. And basically, if you keep adding more and more land for development and you're not enforcing the law on those lands, so you're allowing spills, for example, of wastewater that could scar that land and make that land unusable, and then you also have this land that isn't being fixed right away, you're basically taking up more and more land that has in the past been used for other life purposes. I mean, the rancher that I mentioned earlier, he has been there for generations, and this type of thing could chase him out of business, and a lot of ranchers were worried about that.
So I want to get back to sort of this understaffing at the BLM there. This is happening, if I'm reading this right, at the same time that a record $972 million lease for drilling in that area was signed. So there's clearly the federal government's getting a lot of money for drilling in this area, and yet they're still not really staffed up to the levels that they probably should be.
Yeah, that is a very good point. I think it's one of the costliest leases that has ever gone through the BLM in this area. It's just such highly coveted land, and this understaffing at the agency, this inability to keep up with all the permits that are coming in, or even to accurately track what activity is going on this land, let alone go around and enforce the law as it's laid out. I mean, it's definitely a problem for them, and they acknowledge it. They know. Overall,
the agency, the Department of Interior that you were covering, it's had Ryan Zinke in charge of it, and now it's got David Bernhardt as the acting secretary. He's a former fossil fuel lobbyist. Is this what we're going to be seeing in the future, is just more of this oil and gas development on these public lands and kind of expedited environmental reviews, lack of enforcement of the laws that are on the books, and rollbacks for regulations that have already been on the books for a few years now?
Yeah, I think people would expect more of the same with the nominee to now lead the Interior, David Bernhardt. He's already kind of come under fire for dealing with issues now in his position in ways that would be in line with views that his past clients, when he worked at, I believe it's a law firm, and he's already come under fire for basically some decision making that would benefit past clients, where people say, isn't that a conflict of interest? And his clients aren't only oil and gas, although, definitely oil and gas members of that industry have, as Reveal reported recently, kind of touted those relationships with David Bernhardt and their ability to get into the room. But they've also related to water districts and pesticide companies. The Interior is a huge agency, so while the Bureau of Land Management deals with public lands, Interior also manages water scarcity issues and water supply issues through the Bureau of Reclamation. It also manages coal mining through the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement. So it has a big reach, and he has had a lot of clients who go across that. And so people would expect him to continue definitely along the line that Ryan Zinke had already been going down of making decisions that industry generally would support in terms of loosening regulations and making it easier to get development done more quickly.
There's more than one layer of government in this country. A federal court recently ruled that BLM needed to stop leasing on 300,000 acres of public land in Wyoming because the agency hadn't adequately considered the impact of climate change when leasing. Do we have any idea how this might impact drilling on public lands, this decision? Or is this basically kind of a one-off, maybe we'll see something or maybe another court will overturn it?
Well, I mean, I think it could go any sort of direction, right? I mean, it's always possible. I would expect that this kind of decision could definitely be appealed by industry. It's definitely not something that the Trump administration would like. But I think that something that's important about this decision to recognize is that what the court is saying is not saying you can't lease this land. What the court is saying is you didn't do your due diligence before you leased this land and decided upon this land use. So I think that, TBD on what we could see in the future. I think similar lawsuits and litigation will likely be brought by environmentalists who will be excited about this decision and maybe motivated to continue to file these kinds of suits in a big way. We can't know right now what ultimately this is going to mean for public lands. There's too many more layers for us to go through.
So I wanted to ask you, just looking back on your reporting, was there anything that sticks out in your mind, like any big surprises that you had or experiences? It could really be anything. I'm always just curious when I talk to people who do this kind of work. What sticks with you?
Well, there were two things for me that made this story hit home. Maybe three, actually. One, I mean, I had looked at public lands before, but not as closely and not as on the ground as I did for this story. And I think that talking to local officials in Carlsbad and the nearby communities, because it's not just Carlsbad, there's Lee County and other counties as well, or Eddy County more broadly, which is where Carlsbad is. But there's a real lack of control that local government has in terms of how this land that surrounds them is used. There is this public comment process, and that's why we have it. But even in terms of enforcement, the lack of enforcement that BLM has at its office really impacts the locals. It impacts local communities who can't just give more money to enforce these rules because often the BLM is the only one who can do that job. So to me, that was really poignant about how these decisions about funding are made so far away in Washington. But if you had to drive on some of these roads that you could see were not necessarily well maintained or just had trash alongside them, or, you saw water being spilled out of trucks, if the people in Washington had to deal with that themselves on the ground, something that I heard from local people a lot was some of these problems that we're seeing here just wouldn't exist. People would take them more seriously. Another thing that we've kind of talked about was the whole idea of how a lot of these problems weren't just the Trump administration, right? Like you would think of it that way, but these problems occurred also under the Obama administration in terms of staffing and in terms of the software that they're using. And it seems so silly to keep coming back to kind of this software, but the idea of a federal office creating a software and then it not actually working on the ground directly translates into some of these problems that we were talking about, where you can't actually know how many permit applications have been processed, what development is actually occurring there. It makes it really difficult. Like, they told the BLM office just a couple of months before my story came out, told a local paper that they had something like 900 permits approved over a given period. And to me, the data that I received was something like less than 400 over that same period. And I got my data through public records from the agency, and no one could explain this discrepancy to me. And so the chaos of it was shocking to me, that that could be something that the federal government was in charge of. And the fact that that had occurred under administrations like the Obama administration that weren't like the Trump administration, that had prided themselves on really being, if not protectors of the land, at least more moderate on how they would use it, and, you know, balancing conservation a little bit more with development.
Interesting. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you think is important to mention?
I think we talked about it all.
Okay, we did it all. You know what we didn't do? We didn't do the sage-grouse, but we'll save that for another day.
Sage-grouse will have its day.
Sage-grouse will have its day on Trump on Earth. Rachel Leven is a reporter for the Center for Public Integrity. Go to publicintegrity.org to see her reporting on oil and gas drilling on public lands. Rachel, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a blast.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. Trump on Earth is produced by the Allegheny Front. Our producer is Andy Cubis. The executive producer is Kathy Nauer. The podcast is supported in part by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. You can also support us. Go to patreon.org/TrumpOnEarth to help us out. My name is Reed Frazier. Thanks for listening. See you next time.